Hello, everyone, and welcome to the review for the second exam in English 325, Grammar and Usage. I want to start out by letting you know that this is kind of a comprehensive course. You can't just disregard certain elements once you've learned them. So anything that we have covered up to this point in the semester is fair game for the review. So kind of go back and review if there's anything you felt unsure about in the last exam. You might want to brush up on that. This review will focus on the things we've covered since then, particularly noun clauses, because I do want to make sure that you're understanding the newer elements. Also, we will not be covering relative and adverb clauses. The way this course is set up, we don't test on the material from the test week. So anything in week 8 that we've covered is going to be on the following test. So that hopefully should help you feel a little bit less stressed. I want to start out with just a really quick overview of the adverbs versus adjectives, some of the common mistakes that people make as they're speaking. So keep in mind that with each of these sets that we're going to be looking at, one is functioning as the adjective, one is functioning as the adverb. You just need to remember which is which. And there are a couple of examples that I'll emphasize as we go through. So good, remember, is an adjective. It means it's describing a noun, a person or a thing. So a good book, a good singer, it is good, he is good. In those last two cases, good is the subjective complement, modifying whatever the subject of the sentence is. Well is the adverb, and keep in mind that we often associate adverbs with modifying verbs, but it can also modify adjectives or other adverbs, and we'll see examples of that as we go through today. So she sings well, it's describing how she sings, how I did on the test. He is well read is an example where it's modifying well read, the adjective. The one big exception here where you hear a lot of errors, probably on a daily basis, is when we're referring to health or overall well-being. So if somebody says, how are you feeling? We always say, oh, I feel good. That's really, really common. But when it's referring to health or overall being, I feel well. I am well, rather than the common mistake of I feel good or I am good. Also note that I put comparatives and superlatives at the bottom, but I really don't think there's going to be too many issues with that. Bad versus badly, same thing. Bad is the adjective, badly is the adverb. This one's a little bit more easy to remember because we associate adverbs with ly endings, and badly does end with an ly ending. It was a bad movie. I had a bad time. She performed badly. It was badly edited. The one exception here that you need to pay attention to that is often misused is with linking verbs. I feel bad. The idea here is that bad is not modifying the verb feel, it is modifying the subject. So it is functioning as a subjective complement. Okay, so if it's a linking verb, just remember that you use the adjective. So just think about that when you see that. The last ones are real and really and sure and surely. Again, the ly endings indicate the adverb endings. Most of us tend to use this correctly unless you're from the South or some rural areas, like some of my neighbors, actually. The most common is he was real angry this morning, and I even say it with an accent because it just sounds hickish. No offense if you have done that on occasion. So just remembering, if you're modifying anything except a noun, it needs to be really. He was really angry. It was a real diamond, noun. He worked really hard, hard being what's being modified. And then sure and surely is the same thing, not quite as commonly misused, but you hear it occasionally. That one you can maybe look at in terms of alternate words, sure meaning certain and surely meaning certainly. So if the answer is certainly, would it be all right if I came over tomorrow? Certainly or surely. And something being certain or true or sure is a sure thing. Again, modifying thing. Okay, sentence patterns. I'm putting up this one, and I didn't put up the more high-tech version, which you're probably using, just to remind you that as we get into noun clauses and as we start working with ever more complex sentences in this class, It all boils down to this one page. If you can simplify things down to their basic elements, it becomes much easier to deal with them, to determine what the sentence pattern is and to determine how things are functioning. So as we're focusing on noun clauses, remember that anywhere there is a noun, and we've been working with simple nouns, you can substitute with a noun clause. So any subject can change from a simple noun to a noun clause. Subjective complements. Anywhere you see anything that is a noun, you can replace it with a noun clause. So as you're going through these things, as you're diagramming, and especially as you're identifying sentence patterns, boil it down to its simplest element, substitute a simple noun in there so you can see how it condenses down to just a simple 3 or 4 elements to get the sentence pattern, and then expand it back out by putting the noun clause in. So a clause at its very simplest is a subject and verb. It has to have those 2 elements. Most of the time it has other stuff, but it has at least those 2. And because it has a subject and verb, remember that it has a sentence pattern. Even though it's not a complete sentence unto itself, if it has a subject and verb, those are the 2 minimal elements that you have to have for a clause. So as we're diagramming these things, remember that you have to have a clause or a sentence pattern for the main independent clause and one for the noun clauses that we'll be working with. Noun clauses take the place of a simple noun in a sentence. So start working on the premise that you're working with a simple noun. Put a simple noun in there to replace it, and then substitute the clause back in. Noun clauses are dependent clauses. In other words, they can't be by themselves. They have a subject and a verb, but they do not express a complete idea on their own. They have to be linked to an independent clause to make sense. They can be replaced by several words, the most common and useful being it, something, or someone. So as you get to a noun clause and you're trying to figure out sentence patterns and how it connects to the dependent clause, or the independent clause, excuse me, often it's helpful to substitute those things, those words in while you're working on the global level. And then when you're getting ready to address just the noun clause, replace those words by the noun clause. And I'll show you what it means as we're going through, especially as we're practicing diagramming sentences. Red flag words that introduce noun clauses. Noun clauses don't just magically appear. They're always introduced by one of 2 things. The first is an interrogative. Interrogatives are question words, but in this case, they're not being used to ask questions. They're being used to introduce noun clauses. When a noun clause follows an interrogative, these interrogatives are diagrammed as part of the clause. So they're actually put into the main diagram as compared to expletives, which we'll get to in a minute. So the first one, they can be diagrammed as nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. Remember that nouns sound and feel like nouns. They're functioning as nouns, even though they're question words. So who implies people. What implies objects, okay? So they're dealing with the idea of subjects or objects. They're indefinite, they're vague, but functionally in the sentence, they are serving as nouns. The second category is adjectives, which or whose. Those are our adjective words, which one and whose is this. So they're going to be diagrammed under the noun that they modify. And then the last one is when, where, why, and how, which are the adverbs. Those are adverb questions. And so hopefully you've gotten kind of into that groove, and it won't be too much of a leap to realize that now instead of just asking the question, I'm putting that question word in where I would diagram an adverb. Expletives are little words or phrases. The whether or not does not tend to be a little word, but they don't have any real meaning. They don't carry grammatical weight. They're just connective tissue. They need to be there for the flow of the sentence. But since they don't carry grammatical meaning, they're not diagrammed as part of the main diagram. They're on the little dotted line, the ledge on the dotted line above the verb of the noun clause. And we'll see examples of all of these. Okay, before we get into diagrams, I just want to remind you that there are 7 ways that nouns can function, and there are 7 ways that you can use noun clauses as well. The first is the subject of the sentence. It's what's doing the action of the verb. So the verb in the first case here is disappeared, and then we have this whole big long phrase that is who is doing the disappearing. The premise is the same. We have a subject, whether it's one word or many, that is doing the verb. Subjective complement, remember those are patterns 2 and 4. It's a noun that follows either a be verb in the case of pattern 2 or a linking verb if it's a pattern 4. And it's giving us more information about the subject, hence that backslash that's showing it's pointing back to the subject. So the question was, question is our subject. Have our be verb was what? The question was something. So that's going to go in that slot. And I just want to show you that you can boil these down to just a few simple elements. And if you think of it as that, it becomes much more manageable. Nouns can be a direct object. In other words, they're receiving the direct action of the verb. So we wondered something. And that something was when the train arrived. Indirect object is receiving the direct object that's receiving the action of the verb. So we gave a prize. We, as our subject, gave what? A prize. And to whom is the indirect object. So these noun clauses are going to fit in the exact same slots where you've been used to putting the simple nouns, but the simple noun now disappears, and in the place of that simple noun you would have a pedestal. So if you're talking about an indirect object, it's going to be a pedestal. Remember that nouns always go on horizontal lines. So your noun clauses are going to be on a pedestal on some sort of horizontal line. We can have an objective complement, which is very similar to the subjective complement. This is only pattern 10. In this case, instead of modifying the subject or giving us more information about the subject, the noun or noun clause is clarifying the direct object. It can be an object of a preposition. So we know that prepositional phrases are composed of a preposition plus the noun that follows that's being related to something else. Again, prepositional phrases are going to go somewhere under. Prepositional phrases can function as adverbs, they can function as adjectives. So it depends on where that's going, but it's going to go underneath. And again, the noun goes on the slant, so the preposition goes on the slant, the noun goes on the horizontal. So instead of having that simple noun, you would have a pedestal with a noun clause on top of it, showing that it is the object of a preposition. The last one, which is not terribly common, but we run into occasionally, is an appositive. And if you need some reviewing, remember that it is another noun or noun clause that is clarifying an earlier noun. It immediately follows the first noun. It's almost always offset by commas, and it doesn't have to be there for the sentence to make sense. In other words, you can take out whatever's between the commas, lift it out of the sentence, and the sentence just flows normally. So Aaron, who lives next door, is coming over. I could easily say Aaron is coming over, and that's a complete sentence. We have subject, verb, and a complete thought. But I'm giving you a little bit of extra information clarifying Aaron. Okay, so remember, it follows directly after. When you're diagramming it, it goes in parentheses. If I was saying Aaron, my neighbor, is coming over, then I would just put neighbor in the parentheses. That's my simple noun. When I have the noun clause, everything stays the same except the simple noun is replaced by the noun clause on the pedestal. So in this case, the pedestal would go in between the parentheses to show it's in the positive. This will make more sense as we get into actual examples. Keep in mind, don't eat the elephant in one bite. Take a bite at a time, check yourself, think through things, and go slowly, and it becomes much, much more manageable. Remember, the first thing you do, you start with a subject, you look for a verb, and then you kind of go from there. Remember, as I said earlier when talking about noun clauses, they're dependent clauses, which means they're always going to be attached to an independent or main clause of the sentence. So the first thing I do with all of these, no matter the order of the sentence or the construction, I look for the main independent clause in the sentence. So subject, verb, and stands alone. Sean repeated his query. He repeated his question. Sean is my subject. Repeated is my verb, and query is my direct answer. What is he repeating? He's repeating the query. So that is my main idea. It can stand alone. It's the main diagram, okay? And I can stop right there and say it's a pattern 7 because I know it's subject, action, verb, direct object. I put my possessive down there. Okay, then I have a comma, which is nice because commas kind of help us break up things into our bites. Whether or not she would consider him as a husband. Here's my red flag word. It's an expletive, so I'm going to leave that to the very end because it's not going to be part of my diagram. So then I put, this is, in this case, it's functioning as an appositive. Because what is his query? We have a noun clause that is